So in this presentation, I'll be walking you through my process for creating UX motion for digital systems and product design. A little about myself. I'm a UX motion designer. I have a background in visual effects and animation and have been creating motion designs for product teams for over the past decade. I've built UX motion systems for a number of platforms: mobile, wearable, automotive, and mixed reality. My focus areas are UX motion, which to me is to leverage motion design to improve usability. Another focus area of mine is auditing platforms to find where motion should and should not belong in an application. And I have extensive experience in conceptual design and experimental exploratory visual effects within applications. I also specialize in streamlining dev handoff to ensure the design proposals can easily make it into the application. At a high level, my process is 3 steps: auditing, designing, and dev handoff. And these are the steps that I'll now be breaking down. The auditing process is something I've devised over the past 10 years working on design systems. I've found that by breaking down the entire application into every initial and final state of the interface, that is where you can find the opportunities for motion design. Because ultimately, navigating an application is to proceed through a sequence of information spaces. And by looking at every initial and final state and factoring in the context of that relationship, that will tell you what motion design is warranted that will improve user experience. These are the forms of UX motion design I'm looking for when auditing. And all of these are ultimately to remove uncertainty during interaction and to try to ensure the user experience is uninterrupted and to not negatively impact the user's sense of flow. Gesture confirmation. So when the user interacts with the app, they know their input has been registered instantly, which would most time mean anything under 400 milliseconds. Motion affordance, which is the idea that users will look at anything that is moving. So this essentially gives you the ability to control where the user's focus can be. Masking latency, which is if there's ever a delay, we can leverage motion to captivate users to mitigate any risk of them dropping off. Because motion is inherently captivating, we can leverage it correctly to relieve the burden of any wait time. And finally, spatial continuity. This is the idea of maintaining context between information spaces so the user can remain oriented as they navigate. And when done right, this can create a mental model for users and ultimately streamline navigation so the user will know how to get to their desired information space whenever they need. So for a full-blown audit, I would map out every interaction and break it down in this way. So what you're seeing is a music player with the initial state on the left and the final state on the right. And if the user were to click this minimized player, it would take them to the final state, which is the player being expanded to full screen. The opportunities I see here are first gesture confirmation. So when the user clicks the player, there should be some time-based visual affordance to assure the user their gesture input has been instantly registered. And the relationship I see between these states is a spatial one. The player should transition in the form of an expansion animation that will create a perceptual relationship between the two containers that ideally will have with it a navigational implication that shows users how to get back to where they were. They should be able to swipe down and the player should go back to being minimized. In the second audit, we again see the initial and final states, and the context here is the user will select a song from the playlist and the minimized player will appear. So again, with gesture confirmation at the point of interaction, and the relationship between states I see is motion affordance, which will ideally draw the user's attention to the update to this user interface. This will draw their attention, but it will also make the state change much more obvious, which is something that can correct for any change blindness in the event that the users are looking at where they interacted instead of any other part of the interface. For the final audit, we see an interface that is loading. So there is a delay here on the left screen, and on the right screen is the loaded player interface. So the relationship here is to mask the latency to avoid users leaving this app. This can be tricky depending on the different wait times. If the user has to wait 2 seconds versus 5 or 10 seconds, this will warrant different approaches to masking latency. For this example, I'll show how to hide a 10-second delay, which would be considered a risky amount of time for users to wait. So this is where a lot of my time has gone into over the course of my career, which a lot of motion designers consider to be the most difficult part of UX motion design. After auditing and designing, I then coordinate with engineers to give them what are essentially instructions for building these animations. When it's needed, I map out the property values that are being changed over time within the interface. And for each of those properties, I create a diagram that shows their exact value and how much it changes over time in milliseconds. And to further make implementation easier, I have typically used a very small amount of easing curves. I aim to use 1 to 2 easing curves that apply to all of the animations across the entire application, without affecting the aesthetic of the motion designs and without compromising the user experience. So for every motion design, I typically provide a video reference of the design, timing specification documentation as needed, and when possible, I generate JSON files using a program like Lottie. And that's it. That's my entire process for creating UX motion design. Thank you.